Un mundo tan desafiante, nuestro reto es ser la luz, dar amor día con día.
Ven y seamos esperanza, testimonio de valores, de unidad y de alegría.
Thank you for coming to this. I'm delighted to be invited back to Guadalajara. I was here about 5 or 6 years ago doing research for the book that I'm going to talk about this afternoon or this morning. And I appreciate the invitation from the organizers of this conference. Glad I could bring my wife, Deanne, with me. Her first time in Mexico, if you don't count Tijuana, I guess. So much of what I'm going to talk about today is from this study of Christian young adults in 7 different countries that produced this book entitled The Future of Christian Marriage. It is a study of the marital impulse or the desire to marry. It's particularly relevant for this venue, Guadalajara, today because one of the 7 countries we conducted interviews in was Mexico, and the majority of those interviews were conducted right here in Guadalajara. And I'll quote some from those in a few minutes. I want to focus on 2 things this morning, and I want to make this practical. So I'm going to begin talking about our situation, the state of marriage among Christians today. Then I want to describe things that we can do to help aid our situation. Solutions that we can control. There are solutions that require more time and that are outside of our control, but I want to focus on the things that we can actually do to help make good things happen. However, the kinds of solutions I will talk about can be a double-edged sword, meaning they can help aid the marital impulse, or if played differently, they can make matters worse. One more note of caution. When I talk about solutions, I'm not necessarily talking about what will make your own marriage happen or your own marriage better. They might, but it's certainly not guaranteed. I'm talking about creating a marriage-friendly culture in your life, your household, and together inside the church. But first, we have to talk about our problems, our situation. To get a quick assessment of the situation, I want to give you just a few numbers. Talk about how we got here, including a quick overview of the curious manner in which oversight of marriage has shifted historically. First, it's fair to say that marriage is in a recession, not a depression. A recession. Marrying in one's 20s has receded dramatically throughout the West. We can map the free fall over a few decades, the blink of an eye in the history of marriage. Now, getting married in your 20s does not mean the salvation of marriage. It is, however, a marker of the state of the institution of marriage, because widespread delay into the 30s results in fewer overall marriages. And biologically, if there's going to be a connection between reproduction and marriage, which there is, well then at some point in the 20s is a pretty good time to marry. But the median age for marriage in Mexico is now just over 30 for women and 33 for men. This average age, 30 to 33, has climbed 4 years in the past decade, the past 10 years. That's a staggering number, 4 years on average growth in 10 years. Population averages don't usually change so quickly. In the United States, by comparison, that same number is about half the rate that it rose in Mexico recently. There's no doubt that how marriage begins is rapidly changing here in Mexico. Also, marriage is now widely perceived as a capstone, rather than a foundation. This means that marriage is now thought of something that individuals aspire to, something they want to accomplish, rather than something a couple enters into in order to help them fulfill their aspirations and in order to accomplish the things of life. This change from foundation to capstone means that most of us no longer think of marriage as a formative institution, something that can make us better, stronger, but rather we now think of marriage as the institution that we enter once we think we are fully formed. When marriage was considered foundational to the life course, more people entered into matrimony, and they did so earlier than they do today, typically by several years. There was an emphasis on building something, constructing something, a family, a household, perhaps career and financial success. Such marriages were commonly characterized by love, but they were intended to be practical. Two people taking shelter together and celebrating what achievements they could. They mustered those as a team, even if their roles were distinctive, and they often were. But the shift from foundation to capstone has largely gone unnoticed over the past 50 years. We did not wake up one day or observe in 1 year and declare, that the institution of marriage has changed. We didn't do that, but it certainly has. Parents now advise their children to finish all their degrees, launch their careers, become financially independent before even thinking about marrying. Now, why do parents do this? Because we increasingly perceive dependence as weakness, vulnerability. Don't rush into a relationship, they caution. Hold out for a spouse that is a great fit. You have plenty of time. You do not want to be dependent upon a mate. As a result of our stories, many Christian young adults sense that putting oneself in the trust of another person may be foolish, risky. And children are obeying their parents here. They are not rebelling. We now get ourselves ready for marriage, rather than marrying to get ourselves ready to accomplish common objectives, a home, work, family. Instead, marriage itself has become one of those objectives, a personal achievement signaling that they have made it. Social media did not cause this to happen, not at all, but it does encourage it. We glamorize marriage as an achievement that only some are worthy of. It's an Instagram moment. I cannot overemphasize how monumental, how consequential, and subtle this shift is. Marriage is morphing away from being a populist institution, one which characterized about 90% of adults, to becoming an elite, consumption-oriented arrangement that maybe half to 2/3 of young people will eventually, someday, participate in for a while. The capstone vision has unwittingly turned marriage into an luxury good, unaffordable for many. Rich and poor alike perceive marriage in similar ways. but only those of us who are well off can afford it. This is not good. In fact, I hold that marriage has become the social justice issue of our time. Marriage absence creates inequality. But we have some guilt to bear here, because too often we ourselves have understood as something that marriage is something to aspire to save up for, something that costs rather than something that generates. Now, we could blame our Protestant friends, but much of this situation is not their fault. To the Reformers, marriage was not a natural institution, but a human institution, and hence subject to the jurisdiction of civil authority that was somehow answerable to divine law and principle. With that, marriage came to be understood widely as a contract, because contracts are what civil authorities adjudicate. In other words, the Reformation kind of politicized marriage. Yes, the Reformers did note that marriage could be blessed by religious institutions, and they do indeed. But church and state would thereafter compete as authorities over marriage law. In hindsight, looking back, knowing what we know now about how marriage law has been abused today, it seems a remarkable concession to have given a secular institution authority over what includes moral questions involving sexual expression, child rearing, and the care of family members. In the Geneva of John Calvin, of course, it would not have seemed like such a large leap from the church to the city council, but it sure does today. But now we're all in this same situation together: Catholics, Pentecostals, Evangelicals, Anglicans, etc. So that's our situation. It's not great, but it's not hopeless. Several minutes in, and I'm going to move already to solutions. Plenty of what I want to talk about is not about your marriage per se. Some of it is about other people's marriages, prospective or actual. Some of these things may fit you, while others just don't. It's all right. But we have to find the thing here that you can help with. I'm not talking about weekly commitments, monthly commitments. I'm not even talking about programs. I'm talking about an ongoing concern and awareness. So, here are 3 things you can do. First, we need to tell more stories. We need to talk about marriage more. Certainly about your own, if you're married, or of your parents, or your in-laws, or even about others. Tell stories about the good and the bad, mistakes made, lessons learned, reconciliation experienced, graces. We have to do this because fundamentally, marriage is learned behavior. Some stories, of course, are exceptional and wide in their teachability. I want to give you one example of that from my book experience. One of the most moving stories about marriage that I have ever heard was told to me in 2015, and it comes to me still whenever I give thought to this book process. I was in a Warsaw hotel restaurant striking up a conversation with a man named Gintaras Grusius. He's the Archbishop of Vilnius, Lithuania. He had spoken at an event the previous afternoon. I sat down next to him at breakfast, and I remarked to him about his exceptional American English, which had no discernible accent. I asked him, "How did you do that?" And then he joked in return, said, "Well, I've worked on it a long time." Then he let me in on the joke. This head of the Catholic Church in Lithuania explained to me that he'd been born in Washington, D.C., spent his youth and young adulthood in Los Angeles, went to college at UCLA, management experience at IBM. He was as American as they come, and I didn't know it. How in the world did he wind up in Vilnius? What came next has never left me. It was an unbelievable account of marital persistence and sacrificial love in spite of the odds against it. The Archbishop explained to me that his father, like not a few displaced Eastern European young men, had wound up on the western side of the Iron Curtain after the end of the Second World War. He could not readily get back to then Soviet Vilnius, and even if he could, the risk of being arrested was great. That's how the Soviets treated their own former prisoners of war. But nor could his wife and daughter get to him. But he didn't give up trying. A year went by, then 5 years. By that time, his dad had moved to the United States. Then 10 years had gone by. 15 years went by. 16 years after the war had ended and the Iron Curtain had divided this family, the three of them, husband, wife, and daughter, were reunited as part of a gift from the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had agreed to allow 100 Soviet citizens reunite with American family members. Ginteris was born a year later, 17 years younger than his only sibling. I'm not sure I have all the details of this story correct. I don't know anything about how the Archbishop's father and mother coped with their exile from each other. I don't know how much effort the father had put into reunification. I presume plenty. Was their reunion as blissful as one could imagine? Or maybe it was marked by a profound awkwardness and the enduring sense that too much time had elapsed, that the two had become very different persons. There are dozens of questions that the sociologist in me would want to ask. But the most compelling aspect of this story is one of undying patience and persistence. It is a story about honoring your marriage in spite of all the forces arrayed against it. I return to that story every now and then. I ask myself if I have what it takes to do what the Archbishop's father did, if it was ever required of me. I wonder whether the West can still make men like that. I don't know. But that the Archbishop's account recirculates in my mind, highlights the power of personal narrative, and in this case, the power of narrative for the maturation of marriage and for the endurance of marriage. The stories people tell, the stories they internalize in their minds, matters a great deal for marriage. Sure, one could say, that's just anecdotal evidence, but that does not weaken its influence in the least. Let's be honest. Survey numbers rarely move anyone. I've been number crunching on marriage and various sexuality-related topics for 20 years now. I published the largest nationally representative study critical of same-sex parenting 12 years ago. And I can testify that a good personal story motivates better than any of those numbers. I'll tell you another story. Not quite as good as the last one. Not as hopeful, but it shows the power of the imagination. Alejandra was a 26-year-old student, part-time nanny, and movie theater employee living here in Guadalajara, who we interviewed for this book. Unlike the Archbishop, she had witnessed a household that was split, not by political enemies, but by a temperamental father. But she still believed in marriage. Slowly, however, that confidence began to erode after a series of failed relationships. She described the world to us as chaotic. Unlike her parents' marriage, Alejandra's relationships had not been violent. They just meandered, going nowhere. You probably know people like her. This encouraged her to be risk-averse, protective. And it also convinced her that cohabiting before marrying is a must, she said, regardless of the church's teaching. She's leveled with us. If you marry without knowing the person, biblically, you're going to get a divorce, she said. Very interesting. At the same time, a vision of the kind of marriage she wants was portrayed on her iPhone background. There was a photograph she took of a 70-something-year-old couple embracing on a beach at sunset. I asked her about it. Those your grandparents? No. Did you know them? No. Why this image? She said, they represent a life together of tenderness, of loving each other every day for the rest of their lives, forever. And she said, I want to find someone with whom I can do the same. And then there's Enrique, a 28-year-old industrial engineer working for a construction company here in Guadalajara. He knows exactly what Alejandra was talking about. He said, we're in a generation where everything is disposable. Everything. Absolutely everything, he said. Everything is easy. Everything is fast. It's so fast to find someone. He should know. He dropped his girlfriend of 5 years when she started pressing him to marry. This pattern is not just visible among unmarried 20-somethings. It's clearly visible among married 50-somethings. The narrative that things just tend to fall apart. This state of affairs is not lost on our leadership. Pope Francis lamented the speed with which people move from one effective relationship to another. Love, they think, can be connected or disconnected at the whim of the consumer, and the relationship quickly blocked. In this way, the Pope observes, we are treating relationships the way we treat material objects and the environment. Everything's disposable. Everyone uses and throws away, takes and breaks, exploits, squeezes to the last drop, then goodbye. That's like the papal version of the short verse in the New Testament. Jesus wept. Then goodbye. He's right. The Holy Father's right. So what's the take-home message here? You have stories about marriage. Your own, others, your parents, your grandparents. Tell them to your children, to your peers, to your spouse. Tell them to the coworker who is nervous, has cold feet about moving a relationship forward. Or to the coworker who seems more adept at using people than at sacrificing for them. You will find the time and the place to tell them the stories, but you have to do it. Marriage is something that can rub off on people. If all they know is bad news, we need to give them hope that good news is possible. But like I said at the beginning, play this wrong, and our stories can scare people away from marriage. We don't have to hide the difficult side of marriage. We need simply to pay attention to what stories you find worth telling and why. Second good idea: help others navigate challenging marriages. Amid efforts to build healthy marriage subcultures by singing the praises of matrimony, there remains a persistent hazard that many people already in challenging unions will feel more discouraged, not less. After all, their marriages may not have felt good for a very long time. A measure of relationship trial, of course, is endemic to the human condition. And I could advise people not to compare their marriages to other people, but that's unrealistic. It's deeply inhuman to pay no attention to those around you. But I also totally believe that an unsightly building can still provide shelter. An unsightly building can still provide shelter. Maria Carmen was a 26-year-old nurse we interviewed in Pamplona, Spain. She thinks her expectations for marriage are very realistic, and there won't be that much difference between what she hopes for and what she can find in a spouse. A key reason for her marital realism is her parents' marital struggles. She said she knows what life can be like. She doesn't expect any surprises. She told us, "My parents are completely different from each other. And what I admire is that they can love each other, even though they're so different, and that they are sharing love because of Jesus Christ. It's surprising for me," she said, "because I see other parents of friends of mine, I think, oh, they're ideal, they're perfect for each other. And then I look at my parents, they're a real disaster. Chalk and cheese," she said. Total opposites. My mother is neurotic, super nervous. My father's very calm, very quiet. But I see, she said, I see that they're able to love each other and reconcile. She said, they fight 80,000 times, but they also know how to make up. To me, that is really incredible, she said. I believe that this is possible because they are accompanied by God's support. Because if not, she said, my parents would have separated years ago. If something is not solid, it will disintegrate. End quote. Maria's comments about her parents' recurring reconciliations highlight the pivotal marital role of forgiveness. Maria's parents embody something that I think helps children learn the art of staying married. That is, argue in front of them, solve problems in front of them. They have to hear us apologize. Forgiveness and reconciliation are elements that are utterly absent in today's wider cancel culture. It's really tragic. Our culture is very interested in justice, but not mercy. But without forgiveness, marriage will not work. We have a language with which to understand and practice this: sin, confession, absolution, redemption, sanctification. Sometimes in marriage, one party carries more of the burden in this reciprocal union of assistance, maybe much of the time. But the promise of the gospel is that even marital imbalances are sanctification, part of carrying one's cross into eternal life. I've met too many people who hold that marriage should not be a site for sacrifice, but strictly for refuge. No, it's both of those. Saint Josemaria Escriva, great saint, lamented this human tendency, one which extends well beyond marital hopes to simpler ones about work, health, material goods, vacations, even tonight's dinner. He said, that happens with so many things in life. We inject them with poetry in our imaginations. We idealize them and come to believe that they are the epitome of happiness and beauty. But then when we have them right in front of us and we see them just as they are, our hearts sink into our boots. These and other comparable experiences prompt several recommendations to help others navigate challenging marriages. First, we must be wary of taking sides. Remember that when we offer comfort by belittling someone else's spouse, we're doing damage to their marriage, an entity that we did not create and which exists independently of each spouse. The temptation to do that is so very strong, often fed by the behavior of one of the spouses. Don't do it. Second, be gentle in critique. We harm our brothers and sisters when we fail to esteem others' unions, fragile though they may be. Praise those aspects of others' marriage that merit it. Remember, a bruised reed he will not break, said Isaiah in what seems to be prophecy about our Lord in Matthew 12. Third, be courageous. If, in fact, many mediocre marriages do not deserve the death penalty, then you should consider speaking up. About 1 in 4 American who are married report having thought about leaving their spouse in the last year. 25% of Americans who are married thought about leaving their spouse the last year. Didn't necessarily do it, thought about it. There are a lot of people in need of marital encouragement. We can help them make and keep the mess manageable. Maybe a mess. It's manageable. Given more time and opportunity and simple survival, a good enough marriage can become better than average. When we do this, we're helping create a subculture that is marriage-friendly. When I talk about marriage-friendly subcultures, it reminds me of the network of young adults that formed around Karol Wojtyła when he was just a parish priest in Krakow. He called it środowisko, translates into environment or milieu. It was about creating a subculture, a social environment in which Christian and human formation could develop amid state and informal opposition. Środowisko was not a program, it was a web of people that revolved around the future pope, from whom they received spiritual direction, education, and around whom they built and enjoyed friendships, doing life together, knowing sweetness amid inevitable suffering. The friendliness and openness of that community stood in contrast to the very hollow nature, the false freedom of communist society. It was a pocket of joyful resistance. We have our own false freedoms today, our own toxic environments. Marriage was not the point of Środowisko, but for many who experienced it, marriage benefited from such a friendly Catholic subculture and caring, engaged priests. Third point, parents, think hard about the marital advice you give. I mentioned this at the beginning already. The topic of parental counsel arose with some regularity among the young adults we interviewed for this book. Some appreciated their parents' advice. Others easily discerned their parents' own relational mistakes and regrets reflected in the advice they were giving, protective, sometimes manipulative. In contrast to the old reputation for hounding adult children about marriage, parents today, many of them survivors of the divorce generation, tend to counsel incessant patience. The children aren't rebelling. It was common for us in this book to hear about 5, 6, 8-year-long dating spells before marrying. Endemic uncertainty stalks young adults and contributes to delay upon delay. Father Jose Leon, a priest who has observed 3 decades worth of students on the campus of the University of Navarra, thinks that parents pressure their young adult children to unnecessarily delay marriage. He told me, parents prevent children from taking risks. I said, what kind of risks? You're too young, they say. Marriage is too difficult. That's the message that parents are giving to children, he said. This is hardly a new priestly observation. St. John Chrysostom, 4th century bishop, maintained that parents were disregarding their duty to help their children toward marriage. The parents would tell Chrysostom, it's better to wait until the children gain prestige and they shine in public activities. At least it's not a new problem. But Chrysostom balked at that logic, detecting in their hesitation an obsession with the material, the ephemeral, to the neglect of the spiritual and the eternal. He said, it's like that because our souls are considered an accessory, because we are neglecting the important things. We're making efforts towards that which is secondary. Everything is thus confused and disorderly. Christian young adults report a wide array of experiences with parental guidance. Sometimes mom and dad can be overbearing. Other parents entirely fail to counsel at times when those children need it most. Some parents feel like they have nothing to give, having not received much instruction themselves. Other parents are founts of wisdom that go unheeded. You can't go wrong, however, in keeping in mind the spiritual well-being of your children over your own pride, over your own expectations, even if that means making countercultural choices. Whether they go to Harvard or no university at all matters not at all compared to their eternal soul. Keep in mind what endures, not that which is temporary. The book, Future of Christian Marriage, has several other ideas to help bolster the marriage impulse, but I've run out of time to talk about them. Marriage is pivotally important to the church and to the world, even if the world doesn't know it. It's also pivotally important to the health and well-being of children. Remember, the very first person to express belief in our Lord by jumping up and down when his mother met the mother of our Lord was also the first Christian believer to be martyred. And why? Because of a wrongful, immoral marriage. Marriage must be important. Thank you.
En un mundo tan desafiante, nuestro reto es ser la luz, dar amor día con